It is for me a very important thing to make the connections within these various areas with my own philosophy and ideals around the dignity and humanity of people of African descent. Entrenched in that is my work as a historian in looking at enslavement and colonialism and how that has, for almost 4 centuries, determined the fate of Africa and people of African descent. It is not an easy thing as a woman of African descent to sit back and do nothing. And so I spend a lot of time talking about how we can better ourselves given our realities. The reality is that in the Caribbean, we have commenced steps towards looking at that dignity and looking at that humanity by dealing with some very important questions. Why should a group of people who were transported from Africa to the Caribbean, not of their own will, trafficked essentially into the Caribbean, why should we continue to accept that we are lesser people than our colonizers? That is important and fundamental because it helps you to focus on what you can do, not what somebody else can do, but what you can do and how you can plan and how you execute a plan to raise that humanity. And I spend a lot of time thinking about humanity because legally, people who were transported from Africa to the Caribbean were defined in law as chattel. Chattel means that you were part of property. It means that deep inside of colonialism, there is an inhumanity that can look at a human being and say that you are mine, you are part of my inventory, that I can buy you, that I can sell you, that I can treat you however I want. And that has happened for a long time. So how do I now respond? In the Caribbean, there have been numerous examples of resistance to colonialism. It didn't start in the 1940s or 50s with the independence movement. It didn't start in the early 20th century with Pan-Africanism. It started from the day we were enslaved on the continent and brought onto a ship that transported us across the Atlantic. That trafficking meant that many of us died on a perilous journey. A journey that said that my life was not worth anything. That my life could be dispensed with for insurance purposes. So my ancestors were thrown overboard and the slave owners, the criminals who did that injustice to Africans were still given insurance money. And you brought me to a plantation where I was worked almost to death. There is a very interesting conversation as to whether or not there was genocide committed in the Caribbean against Africans and people of African descent. Because genocide is a legal term as defined by the colonizers themselves. It has been very hard to prove. But how do you account for the fact that in the British Caribbean, and I use that as an example, more than 3 million, almost 4 million Africans were brought to the Caribbean. And at the time in 1834 of emancipation, only 850,000 people were freed. It means that there was trauma, that there was murder, and that is entrenched in colonialism. And we didn't sit back and accept that we were inhuman and that you could do that to us, that you could beat us, that you could rape us, that you could kill our children. We didn't sit back and accept that. We revolted. We became revolutionaries. We became freedom fighters. And with that freedom, we were able to build independent communities. We call them maroon communities. I call them independent African communities in many of our countries. We come to the point where we have the first major revolution in the Caribbean, the Haitian Revolution. And this revolution freed enslaved people and established an independent black country. And for the first time, you saw colonialists come together in the form of the British, the French, and the Spanish to defeat that revolution. Napoleon made it very clear that the Haitian Revolution could never succeed because it would make sure that blacks moved forward. What do you do at the end of the Haitian Revolution? You surround that country from military and extract from it reparations, a ransom, an independence ransom, that 150 million gold francs, that country would be paying until the 20th century, the 1940s. It is now 200 years since that happened. And France is only now speaking about reviewing what was done to that country. At the end of emancipation in the British, in the French colonies, those who were enslaved never got repayment. They never acknowledged that we deserved something from moving out of slavery, enslavement, to freedom. Instead, those who enslaved us were compensated. And today, we are moving forward in the Caribbean with a reparatory justice movement asking for reparations for all the harm that was done for 300 years of enslavement, and also for the subsequent congenital colonialism that has kept us dependent on countries that were supposed to be taking care of us. I really believe that it is time for the global community to look at issues related to anti-black racism, destruction, continued destruction, violence, and look at the systems that continue to perpetuate that concept of empire. As I said before, empire was built around genocide. Empire was built around land grab, because when Europeans came to the Caribbean, there were indigenous people living there, and they pretended that these were not human beings. Then you bring human beings, so you dehumanize one population of indigenous people. You dehumanize Africans. You continue to dehumanize people from Africa. And you then, after independence, after the wars and moving towards independence, set up systems that entrench that kind of racism, that kind of oppression, that kind of destruction, to create dependency, underdevelopment, and to ensure that you have a system in place that will make you or perpetuate the view that you are a world leader. The two things don't mesh. They don't. You cannot, on the one hand, commit crimes against humanity and turn around and tell that same humanity that they must fall in line with a world order that has never respected them, that has never given them dignity. I think it is important for the reparations movement that the CARICOM has revived, because the reparations movement has been around for a long time. During enslavement, all of these revolutions were about, and these resistance was about bettering our conditions. We always wanted our conditions to be better. We never accepted that we were property. We were human beings. And so our reparations movement must ensure that at the end of the day, that we bring back dignity. I think that that must be the root of reparations. My philosophy with regard to the basics of colonialism, because there is so much more. How do you think that we should respond to colonialism? How do you think we should move towards decolonization?
We have one of the colonies in the Caribbean, and your question is very valid. How do we address colonialism in a contemporary sense? You gave a very strong historical analysis of it, and as we arrived, and we recall, of course, being from the Caribbean, both of us are aware of the fact that the enslavement of African descendants was the resulted in an ending of that, in emancipation in some instances. The British administered the Caribbean, the French administered the Caribbean, the Dutch, the Danish, in our case, as well, and the United U.S. Administered Caribbean. But in many cases, the end of colonialism, at the end of slavery in those places, resulted in over a century of colonialism. And many of the territories, of course, moved to independence. However, in our region, we have the largest number of non-independent territories in any other region of the world in such a small space. So we have the challenge of dealing with colonialism in the context of the contemporary times, and this is a major importance in order to adhere to the requirements of international law to bring colonialism to an end. We are now in the 4th international decade for the eradication of colonialism as identified and recognized by the United Nations General Assembly. The challenges remain, and of course we do find that those countries that administer territories are often not so inclined to promote the self-determination and subsequent decolonization of these territories. We have, in other words, a major concern that this situation will persist for some time to come. We of course are very appreciative of the Baku Initiative Group for its work in seeking to bring together those territories that remain, both in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, as well as the Indian Ocean, in order to address the question of colonialism in all of its forms and manifestations from a global level. The president of this country is also increasingly and very actively expressing the view, an anti-colonial context for the remainder of the time that we have, in order to place colonialism and keep colonialism and anti-colonialism and ultimate decolonization on the agenda of the United Nations and on the global agenda in general. But your work in this area has been very well recognized globally, and you continue to work formerly as the president, the chair of the Permanent Forum for Peoples of African Descent, and right now, of course, a very active member of the Permanent Forum. But your work in university as well as diplomatically is something that is well appreciated by us all.
Thank you very much, and thank you for mentioning the Baku Initiative Group. because this is a non-governmental organization. And I have found that non-governmental organizations get to the heart of the matter. They are not limited by the restrictions of what governments, should do and can do for their nationals. And so at the Permanent Forum, we engage with a lot of non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations. And they have been very instrumental in helping the work of the Permanent Forum moving forward. They have hosted some of our meetings. We have broad coalitions of such NGOs of people of African descent that have hosted our meetings, that have assisted us in various ways. And so this initiative, BIG, I like the acronym, ensures that we also look at the issue of colonization and decolonization. But one of my biggest questions and challenges has to do with the fact that decolonization is seen for countries that are not independent. Yet there are countries that are independent, I think, where there is still colonization. Quite apart from colonization of the mind, I think that constitutions are not evolved enough in many independent countries to make sure that they break the shackles of colonialism and dependency. We have lingered so much in these colonial waters of the Caribbean that as independent countries, and I'm from an independent country, St. Lucia, that we do not recognize that it is also the role of countries that have attained independence to also assist those countries that remain as overseas territories to also become independent. How do you feel about, for example, the integration movement and how it can facilitate also decolonization of these countries?
Yes, you mentioned the fact that St. Lucia is one of the countries, indeed, that has been very, very strongly active in promoting decolonization for our territories in the Caribbean. I come from one of those non-independent territories, in fact, the non-self-governing territory of the Virgin Islands. And we also have that challenge, clearly, of moving forward. But the idea of the countries that have become independent and those that have gone through the decolonization process and in assisting other territories can be seen in the active involvement of St. Lucia over time. Ever since the independence of St. Lucia in 1979, the idea that there probably have been at least 5 chairs of the United Nations Decolonization Committee that have hailed from St. Lucia as ambassadors of St. Lucia. And there have been a number of decolonization seminars held in St. Lucia. So there's clearly the importance of that regional support can also be extended, of course, to the regional institutions, regional organizations, particularly CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, of 14 member states, as well as the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, which is a subgroup, essentially a smaller group of countries in the eastern part of our region. Now, very much involved with bringing the territories within the framework of these organizations, and of course bringing them in as associate members in some cases, and also in the case of Montserrat, full membership. So you do find that the integration movement is enhanced by the integration of the territories who are culturally, physically, and part of the region, and bringing that block together in a closer economic tie would then enhance the success of the regional integration movement.
I certainly agree with you with regard to that, the role of the independent countries in assisting with decolonization of these countries. But I think that one of the things that we are missing to a large extent is the fact that we have not spent a lot of time with the education of the populations of these countries with regard to decolonization. One of the things that colonialism has done, and we don't realize it because it's so natural to us, is focuses on language. And the fact that we have lost a language that is indigenous to us. So we depend on communicating with each other in somebody else's language. So in St. Lucia, we speak English as our official language, although we do have Creole as our second language. In Martinique and Guadeloupe, they speak French because of French colonialism. And we have also Creole in these countries. In the Dutch territories, and I continue to think of them as territories and not part of an empire, they have, most of their legal language is Dutch. And the people who live in that country may not even understand what they sign on to legally. We have countries that speak Spanish because of Spanish colonialism. The ubiquitous nature of colonialism has divided us. At the very core, we cannot speak to each other and we cannot understand each other unless we speak somebody else's language. Do you think that there should be a move in the region to facilitate integration around language development? I think that colonialism thrives because we cannot connect at the level of basic communication.
Yes, that is true. And you mentioned the language Creole, which is in effect a written language, a spoken language, and it has evolved significantly amongst the countries that are very closely related. The French territories of Martinique and Guadeloupe are adjacent to independent countries of Dominica and St. Lucia. And clearly the language of choice is Creole. And that you also find in other places in the world of Creole-speaking countries. Haiti, in particular, probably has a very pure form of Creole in the context of their language being directly related to Africa. So the idea of language bringing people closer together as a language, certainly you mentioned also the Dutch Caribbean, where a language that has been evolving there and is also essentially the language of choice is the Papiamento, which is a language spoken mainly in Curacao and Aruba. You find it very interestingly in a place in the Pacific region where I do much of my work. The territories of Guam and Northern Mariana Islands. They are both U.S. administered colonies. And in this case, they have a language known as Chamorro, which is their native language. And both of those territories speak that language. But over time, interestingly, when territories evolve separately politically, then they become, there's a little difference in distinction in the language, if you will. Certain words are a bit different than one and the other. And I suppose, not being a Creole speaker, but I suppose that this is somewhat the case with respect to Creole as well. But the point is that there's a commonality that is a cultural commonality that can certainly be utilized to bring us together and also to inform us one to another and to help us work toward a very broad-ranging regional integration, which is very, very critical for those of us who are in these archipelagos.
Thank you for going back to the issue of integration, because one of the movements globally over the last few years has been the evolution of South-South cooperation. South-South cooperation, I think, is very important because it helps us to break the domination of people who have colonized not just the Caribbean, but also Africa and Latin America. The Spanish were dominant in Latin America. Well, you know how Africa was divided among the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the English, and also the Caribbean in that regard. The Caribbean, for its very small space, has been colonized by every European country that you can, Western European country that you can think of. I believe that our response with regard to South-South cooperation is essential for us to be able to say to each other, look, we have something that we can offer the world in terms of our own development. I think it is something, South-South cooperation says something about us as people who were colonized and oppressed. That we can develop our own systems of integration to work together. That we can invest in each other. That we can trade with each other. That we can innovate together. Africa is the area where technology is developing the fastest, with the youngest population. They're moving towards innovations that would be useful to all of us. But South-South cooperation is hindered by linkages. We don't connect to each other because it takes 24 hours to get from one area to the next, because we have to pass through Europe or the United States to get to each other, and there are restrictions with regard to our own travel. Do you think that investments in our own people, in our own regions, would assist us with breaking down colonialism and the notions of empire?
Well, quite certainly. You mentioned the travel challenges, and that is something which is a clear evidence of the need to actually bring together the ability to travel from one to the other. There was a meeting here in Baku, in fact, quite recently, several months ago, on bringing together NGOs of the Global South. And this was something that was quite extraordinary, and certainly the government of Azerbaijan should be commended for having the insight to bring that together. I think Azerbaijan, being the former chair of the non-aligned movement, has really generated a lot of interest and a lot of support amongst the Global South in the context of those very issues that you have raised. Certainly the question of transportation, but also trade. I'm very happy to see, and you are very involved with this, of course, that there's the issue of travel between Africa and the Caribbean. I like to say that we were once the cargo, but now we will be the captain of the ships that will transport goods and services between, and developing direct air links between the Caribbean and Africa is also something that is emerging, and our leaders of the day are several of those leaders are doing great and making great strides in bringing that to fruition. And it has been tried in the past, but it didn't sustain. But I think what's important is sustainability.
I certainly agree with that. And Azerbaijan has also recently hosted the COP. And for us, climate justice is very important. It's part of the reparations movement. the fact that our countries were devastated because of the plantation system, a plantation system that was used to industrialize Europe. The fact that our soils have been devastated because of overproduction on plantations. That chemicals were used to ensure that that crops grew for consumption in Europe. The fact that these chemicals have caused irreparable harm to our health. All of these things are within the CARICOM 10-point reparations plan. And climate must be the focus. Every year we suffer from hurricanes that have been that because of global warming. And these small islands never get to recover and never get to development, to the level of development that would bring our people decent living standards. And then we have to face international institutions, financial institutions, that then charges exorbitant interest rates and keep us in a state of dependency on a system that was not built for us in the first place. I think that to a large extent, our people have been very critical of some of these institutions and the way they keep us dependent. And I think that recently you have been hearing a lot of conversations with regard to reform in the financial systems, the global financial systems. Reform at the level of the United Nations to give us more access. After all, Africa and the Caribbean constitute the largest bloc of independent countries in the United Nations, but we do not have any of the access that other countries have. I think that we need to start looking at these things seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, you mentioned one point in relation to the use of chemicals in agriculture in our regions, and very interestingly, there's a question of the utilization of this in the colonies, and Martinique is an example of that, where a particular carcinogenic pesticide was being used that actually was banned in Europe, but it was still being used in the Caribbean, and that's something that has caused irreparable harm to not only the persons, but also the safety of the waters and so forth. So these are things that are functions of colonialism that we have to continuously follow and continuously oppose.
I think that it is not simply about the chemicals, but about the nuclear experiments that have been conducted, especially in the French colonies in the Pacific. And I think that it is time that we ask the world whether or not all of these peoples in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in Latin America and Africa are not human beings, are not people who deserve redress for all the harms that have been done to them. And let the world answer that question.
Yes, the issue of nuclear testing and the impacts of 30 years of nuclear testing in Maui Nui, French Polynesia, is very much on the minds of the United Nations currently. There have been a number of studies, both by the United Nations as well as independent studies, which have looked at the impacts, the economic impacts, of course, but more importantly, the health consequences of those, and not only in the individuals who are affected, but it has become intergenerational and has become genetic impact. So this is something which is continually discussed, and we are continually seeking to obtain some redress for this question, and also, as you say, and I fully agree, that we need to ban this activity. And there are a number of treaties to this effect. These treaties need to be enforced and implemented, and new treaties need to be brought into force, because we have one planet, and we cannot permit this planet to be affected in this way?
Well, this has been a great conversation. I thank you for bringing the Caribbean and the Pacific together in this conversation. And I want to thank Baku Initiative Group for ensuring that we were able to meet at a global level on a conversation that is affecting colonized people. And I certainly look forward to us working together in South-South cooperation for us to address further decolonization. There is no full stop when it comes to decolonization. We have to continue.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I too wish to echo your sentiments. Thank the Baku Initiative Group, whose motto, Union, Liberty, and Independence, is very clear. We have to work together on this. Thank you for your point of Caribbean Pacific cooperation, because indeed we are also often in the same place with regards to the diplomatic discussion on how to address decolonization. And we also find that we are of one mind because we are peoples of the equator, and we recognize the importance of the sea. Today I gazed out at the Caspian Sea, and I said, when I see the sea, I feel better. And when I'm in Baku, I can look at the Caspian Sea, and I feel very good.
Thank you.